Our next speaker was due to be Colin Griffiths, but unfortunately he's been caught with a bout of a virus on the train up, had to get off and get on the train going back. So what I have said is I will run through his slides very quickly. So from our point of view, Citizens Advice have been quite big supporters of us right from the start. Before we even had anything attached to walls, they turned up with 7 people to come and look at what we were doing. So they do see the importance of how technology is shaping markets and what effect that might have on the consumer. So for those of the... let me see if I got that the right way around. There we go. For those of you who don't know about Citizens Advice, they've been founded in 1939 and they help people around a whole range of issues, legal issues, access to benefits. So it's not just about energy. And they use their weight to campaign on issues of consumer protection as well. So the team that Colin is part of is around energy futures, consumer futures, which was formerly Energy Watch, and they are now the statutory representative for consumers. And the conversations we've been having with them is very much looking at how the energy transition that we've been talking about will affect consumers. And it's something actually we're quite concerned with as well, because we see aggregators and demand-side response and all the things that smart meters can enable. What does that mean for a consumer, and how can we make sure a consumer is protected and not exploited? So in addition to that, they do some issues around evidence, so they take extensive research. And I think what Colin has identified in their research, which is very much because Colin actually was at Smart Energy GB previously, is there is an enthusiasm for new services, but there are concerns around security and privacy, and certainly having sales people approaching them. I think there's an issue with the suppliers, and I think this is probably been ongoing since we were involved in doing a lot of retrofit work around the interests of the energy suppliers. But transparency and control are at the heart of what the consumer is looking for. I think some of the things you touched on, I think Jagan wins competition for understatement of the conference with the Daily Mail aren't very fond of smart meters because there are a lot of issues around the way they are perceived. And so I think the consumer, especially in the wake of Facebook, in the wake of Google, they're having a recognition that their data has value. And in some respects, their ability to use that data to manage energy, to do the demand-side response and aggregation has value. And how do we protect that for the consumer? I think this is a pretty typical example of the types of things that you find on YouTube, which is now where my father gets virtually all of his news. We can see that there is kind of a negative press around it, and I think there is an onus on us to actually get some positive stories, some positive use cases out there. So looking at the protections that are in place, so I won't go through these in detail, mainly because it's the first time I've seen them, but I think the important thing is where we are is the consumer now is generating large amounts of data, and we can see that the types of services and innovations that can grow around that. And I think the important thing is actually that data, and I think Josh said this, that the data belongs to the consumer, and I think this is where Citizens Advice are trying to protect their interests. So technology doesn't have a great track record. I think we're still reaping the benefits of an early insecure internet. Safety, privacy, and security, bolting it on afterwards is not a good option. So I think we are in a situation where that has, I think, been considered in quite some detail in the infrastructure we're talking about. But there are some implications. So there are some blurred boundaries of product and service. So heat as a service, how we I don't know, I'll be honest with you there. Liability, and I'm doing my absolute best with this. Liability and identifying fault. When something goes wrong, particularly if we have lots of things attached to things, and there is quite a complex infrastructure, if something goes wrong, how do we identify who is at fault? Licensees, not owners, so where consumers lease goods, we might see rights management for everyday items and intellectual property superseding consumer protection. And enforcement, and I think this is a big issue, is what happens when something goes wrong and how is it enforced. Changes that people don't see. I think one of the things that we talked about with consumer access devices attached to smart meters is when people move, when they stop being belonging to the people. How do we know when they've been removed? And there was some work that CAB did on that, so you could look and see what was attached to your consumer access device. Issues of lock-in, so protecting the consumer from monopolies, which are quite important. Data use and how the data is collected, and obviously security. And so I think one of the issues that we're definitely keen on, when we get a room of people like you, and you're digitally aware, you're technically aware, a lot of quite highly educated, there's probably quite a few PhDs in the room, people with master's degrees. What about vulnerable people? Because actually the whole energy market doesn't look like all of the people in this room. And actually what happens when, even if we looked at something like rent a roof for PV, so what happens when the benefit is not accruing, and actually what looks on the surface like a good deal is a bad deal for the consumer, but the consumer doesn't understand the market and the value well enough to understand what's a good deal and how to compare these things. And particularly when you're in a developing market, that can make certain people quite vulnerable. And then that goes above and beyond. If we're doing demand-side response, what happens to vulnerable people who may have higher than normal demands for internal temperatures? All of these issues need to be thought about. Now, it's something we're actually quite interested, because we're talking to Danielle's team at the moment about what happens to vulnerable people in this type of energy transition. So it's a piece of work we're just about to start, and then we'll be looking for funding. So I think what they're worried about is this dystopia of lots of things not fitting together well, people not understanding things, lots of issues about difficulties with the data not being well controlled, and actually it creates risks of distrust. And bearing in mind there's an element of that around the infrastructure already, we need to make sure that the consumer is protected from these types of issues, because we run the risk of making it not a trusted infrastructure, which, bearing in mind it's a critical infrastructure, it's quite a bad position to find ourselves in. This is the utopia in Colin's, interoperability, interchangeability, standards are open and the market is competitive, and consumers have control over their data. We're looking for transparent, amendable systems, and an industry agreeing to an assumption of how things will work rather than seeking to avoid liability for failures. And I think this really goes to the core of what Citizens Advice have been trying to do in this space, and undertaking the research to try and see where the risks for the consumers are, but also, risks for the consumers are risks to the industry as well. Thank you very much. There will be no questions for this presentation.